Aristotle wrote about this in Nicomachean Ethics, that education should be about the ordinate affections of the pupil. As C.S. Lewis says, getting the pupil to desire what he or she ought. So it's not just simply having the right knowledge, but the right affections, not just the right information, but the right desires, aiming your desires towards the direction, towards the trajectory of that which should be desired. So given this, we might say that it is technically possible to have a robust sense of ethics, but actually to lack virtue. So virtue is not ethics. Second, we might say that virtue is about identity before it is about action. One of the reasons that this is very important is because oftentimes when we discuss ethical decision-making frameworks or some of these different things, you'll notice it's about what is the right thing to do, what is the right action, what's the activity that I should engage in. And in fact, if you read a lot of these ethical case studies that you might be presented with in textbooks or whatever it might be, there's some dilemma and you have all these problems, you have information, but then the question at the bottom is, what should this person or what should this company or firm or whatever it may be, whatever entity, what should they do? And again, virtue is concerned with a separate question, not simply what should I do, but who should I be? Because doing is always, always a function of being. This is one of the things, if you're familiar with Alistair McIntyre, what should I do is a function of who am I, and who am I is a function of the community. In fact, indeed, the larger narrative that I find myself within. So it's not simply about the action, it's about the agent who's performing the action. Not simply about doing the right thing, it's about becoming the right kind of person. Some of the listeners may be familiar with John Milbank. He's in many ways a kind of founder or pioneer in some ways of radical Orthodox theory and theology. His wife, Susan Milbank, is also a theologian, philosopher, and had a wonderful paper a few years ago on the virtue ethics of Harry Potter. So Harry Potter fans can celebrate this. But the idea was that at Hogwarts, you're not being taught how to cast a good spell. You're being taught how to be a good wizard. It's not about casting the right spell. It's about being the right kind of wizard. Why? Because good wizards cast good spells. Martha Nussbaum, as quoted by Stanley Hauerwas, says this: a good doctor is also a good poisoner. So it's about the character, because if you just have these skills, if you just have knowledge, it's more fodder, it's greater capacity for harm, unless there's a character, there's an agency that is aimed in the right direction. This is why virtue is important. Not about what you do, but about being the right kind of person, because in being the right kind of person, you will do the right kind of thing. Very interesting example years ago, provocative article written by Joshua Knobe. Joshua Knobe is a philosopher of a particular brand or stripe. He refers to himself as an experimental philosopher. So this is philosophy that actually exercises the scientific method to help get at how people process philosophical situations and dilemmas. And so Joshua Knobe wrote about Mark Pierpont. Mark Pierpont was a popular evangelical years ago, and one of the things he was known for was going to these different venues and preaching against homosexuality, and moreover, in preaching against homosexuality, advocating to be delivered from one's homosexuality through these Exodus programs and whatnot. But there was a problem in all of this. Mark Pierpont himself was gay. And so you actually had two separate Mark Pierpont identities. And oftentimes when we see a conflict of this sort, one person that's preaching against a gay lifestyle, but secretly they're living a gay lifestyle, we hear people say that Mark Pierpont or individuals like this just simply need to be true to themselves. They need to be true to themselves. And Knobe says, well, this is actually a really interesting philosophical question. which Mark Pierpont should he be true to? Should he be true to the closet homosexual suppressing these desires? Or should he be true to the Bible-believing anti-homosexual advocate? Who is the real Mark Pierpont? Will the real Mark Pierpont please stand up? That kind of thing. And what Nobe found was when he talked to people that believed that there was this kind of teleology to sexuality, that God had made us a certain way, had made us for something, had a scriptural biblical foundation, an orthodox understanding of sexuality, they were more likely to say that the real Mark Pierpont was the believing Mark Pierpont, that he could be categorized by his beliefs. However, those who maybe had more liberal views or more open-minded views about how they might think about sexuality, they were far more likely to say that the real Mark Pierpont was the closet homosexual Mark Pierpont. In other words, his identity was constituted by his desires. So what does this tell us? Nobe says the question is not, who's the real Mark Pierpont in the sense of trying to figure it out. The question is answers to who the real Mark Pierpont is, who he should be true to, are bound up in larger questions about what is the nature of a life, what is the purpose of a life, what is the conception of the good life that animates what we do. In other words, in order to answer that question of what Mark Pierpont should do, we have to have a larger answer to the question of what is a person, what is a life, what is our purpose, what is our nature, what is our end, what is the teleology of a human. Okay, another dimension of virtue that I want to talk about to help us understand it is thinking through the idea of wholeness versus the idea of right and wrong. And to introduce this, I want to exercise a little statistical parlance to describe this. Now, in statistics, we have variables. We have these numbers that, or non-numbers that are representative of certain categories, and we call these variables. But some variables are what we refer to as discrete, and other variables as continuous. And a discrete variable falls into a bucket. It falls into a category. And so students are freshmen, sophomore, juniors, or seniors. And by virtue of being one, you can't be the other. That would be a discrete category. Either someone is pregnant or they aren't pregnant. Those are discrete categories. Whereas a continuous category is a variable that can assume any value within a given range or interval. So if we talk about income, money, if we talk about someone's weight, if we talk about SAT score, foul balls at Wrigley Field, all of these things are continuous variables. Now, here's why I introduced this. If we apply this to how we think about right and wrong versus wholeness, right and wrong is a discrete category, right? Either it falls into this bucket of rightness or it neatly falls into this bucket of wrongness, and never the twain shall meet, right? There's nothing in between. And I'm not entirely sure that's a very helpful way of sometimes thinking about morality. Sometimes it is, but maybe a better way, certainly in the faith tradition, for particular categories is thinking about wholeness. And this is, now we're talking about a spectrum, we're talking about a range, we're talking about degrees, iterative moves that make me more and more whole as a human being. If you look at John 10:10, Jesus, this famous expression, I've come that they may have life and have it to the full, and have it abundantly, I think is the NRSV, the abundant life, Jesus is saying. And how do we understand that word abundance? Now, interestingly, there's one Greek idea that is overflowing, right? Think of a glass of water and you just keep pouring more and more in, and it's just overflowing off the sides, the rim of the cup. But there's another idea that means equidistant. And this was what Jesus was capturing in this expression. I've come that they may have the equidistant life, an equal distance, which means all around or complete. Jesus is saying, I've come that they may have a complete life. I've come that they may have a whole life, lacking nothing. This is the life that I want them to have. I think one of the most fascinating quotes from C.S. Lewis, and obviously there are tons of them, comes from this. I believe this is Mere Christianity. He says, people often think of Christian morality as a kind of bargain in which God says, well, if you keep a lot of rules, I'll reward you. And if you don't, well, I'll do the other thing. I don't think that's the best way of looking at it. I'd much rather say that every time you make a choice, you're turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. Each of us at each moment is progressing to the one state or the other. In other words, are we making decisions that make us more whole? Are we making choices, again, to return to Augustine's voluntas? Are we aiming ourselves towards something that brings us wholeness, completeness, fulfillment, satisfaction, gratification? And notice that's different from simply talking about right and wrong. Just a couple of examples of this. I was once, every once in a while, we'll do these panels at the school, and prospective parents and students come, and we get to answer questions about our university, where we work, what it means to be here. And these are pretty standard questions. But one time a prospective student raised her hand and she said, I have a controversial question. So, everyone perks up. And she said, I want to go into literature. How would you think about cursing in literature at your school? And so I decided as the business person, which, I'm not maybe qualified to answer that, but I did have an answer for that. I said, we're a school that believes in the pursuit of wholeness, that God died in the person of Jesus on the cross so that we could live a whole and complete life. And so it's not simply about the rightness or the wrongness of what might be in literature or our content or anything else. Rather, it's about, are we reading texts? Are we creating classroom environments that legitimately allow us to live a whole and complete life? Now, for some, that might sound like an unsatisfactory answer, but I would argue it's only unsatisfactory if their morality can simply be understood in terms of right or in terms of wrong. Christopher West, who's written a lot about Pope John Paul II's theology of the body, he describes this a lot. And he, in one of his excellent companion books to that, he talks about Matthew 19. And you know the story of Matthew 19. At the very beginning, Jesus is confronted by the lawyers, the attorneys, and they come to him and they say, Jesus, how do you feel about divorce? What's your opinion on divorce? And Jesus says, well, of course, from the beginning, God's design was that the male and the female would depart from their families and they would come together and they would be unionized into one, and may no man put that asunder, etc. But this wasn't satisfactory for the lawyers. But they said, now, wait a second. Moses allowed divorce. And Jesus says, right, Moses allowed divorce because your hearts were hardened. But from the beginning, it was not so. And West here is saying that that statement, that simple statement there, from the beginning, it was not so, qualifies all of the gospel message. And what does he mean by this? Notice what's going on here in this passage. The Pharisees come and they say, Jesus, what's permissible? And Jesus says, here's God's design. And then they say, yeah, but what is permissible? And Jesus says, here is God's design. In other words, they want a discrete answer of right and wrong, right? But instead, Jesus is saying, look at a different way. What is the design? What is the purpose? What is the nature? What does God have for you? Get beyond right and wrong and go into the wholeness, the purpose, the teleology that God has for your life. And of course, we know this is what a good rabbi does. He answers questions with other questions in a creative way.